you go.
So I think this is me. I'll start. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time at the summit, and it's been a fantastic day. My name is Elizabeth Bennett. I'm a professor at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. I'm an international political economist, so I work at the intersection of politics and economics. What I think about most is globalized supply chains, and what I care about most is workers' rights and exploitation all over the world. So until a few years ago, most of my time was spent on organic textiles and coffee, and following those around the world, seeing how people were treated when they were working in those industries. And also paying a lot of attention to what consumers were doing. So if you look to see, who made my shirt, where was my coffee grown, what do I want to support with my dollar, I studied consumer activism and global supply chains. For the last 6 years, I've been living in Colorado and Oregon, and thinking a lot about cannabis as this story unfolds. And so for the last 2.5 years, I've been doing a lot of research on these issues as they apply to cannabis in the States. So what I'm interested in is who is growing, who is trimming, and what is their life like? Is it one of dignity and possibility, of agency and opportunity, or is it one of hardship and limitations? So I want to talk about some changes I see happening in the cannabis labor force, what it used to look like, where I think it's going, some of the problems I think are associated with the current and very near future of farm labor and trim labor in cannabis, some special challenges that this industry faces compared to others in addressing these problems, and some suggestions for ways forward. So the cannabis market of the last, say, 30 years, in terms of who is growing and trimming, 75% of the cannabis in the U.S., as you probably know, is coming from the West Coast. Most of the people growing, working for other people on farms and trimming have been white. They've been U.S. born, and they've been migrant labor working in non-agriculture products in the off-season. So that means these are people with a relatively great amount of privilege compared to workers who are in other agricultural industries. That's not to say that there haven't been immigrants and migrant laborers working in cannabis for the last 30 years. There have definitely been pockets of that, but it's not been what's dominant. This is really different than the rest of agriculture. So for the last 30 years, people who have been working in cannabis, the demographic that I just described, have been accepting a great deal of risk in exchange for a great deal of reward. The pay has been very high compared to working in other agricultural sectors. The risk has also been extremely high. So we know that for cannabis grow workers and trimmers, wage theft is pervasive, being promised a wage and not paid that correct amount, or being asked to wait additional weeks or months and being paid a different amount. Sexual assault and harassment is common. Unsafe living and working conditions also common. Between 2012 and 2016, the Humboldt Domestic Violence Service Center said that they receive about 2,000 calls per year from Humboldt County alone, and about 2 people a year go missing who have been working in cannabis in Humboldt County. Those statistics are much higher than in other places. So as I've been working with trimmers and with workers, I have yet to encounter one trimmer who's been working for over 5 years in the industry who has not had a personal experience of some sort of labor exploitation or has not personally known someone who has had that experience. We don't have good statistics on the demographics of the labor force and the amount of exploitation, but we know it's at least on par with with other agricultural products in the United States. Everyone has a story. So that's what we've been looking at for maybe the last 30 years. Things are changing. I see the changes in labor force going in different directions for the illegal and the legal markets. For growing and trimming on the illegal market, prices are falling. The days of getting a huge amount of value for product are largely over. I think someone said this leads to innovation and communication, which is fantastic. It also leads to different types of labor exploitation. So what I'm starting to see happening in the illegal market is attracting people who are willing to work for less money. These are often migrant workers, new immigrants, people with legal statuses that are less straightforward. Extremely vulnerable populations are beginning to work in illegal cannabis at greater numbers than have ever before. So this is starting to look a lot like big agriculture. Big agriculture in the U.S. is a place where the most vulnerable people in our population work. People who are extremely susceptible to exploitation. So to give a sense of what that would look like for cannabis to move to the big ag model, each year in the United States, 300,000 agricultural workers report pesticide poisoning. 20,000 agricultural workers report acute pesticide poisoning.
Wow.
Those are reported accounts, not estimates based on reported data. So that's at the very, very low end of what's possible. That's a lot of people with too much pesticide exposure. That helps us understand why life expectancy is shorter in the United States for agricultural workers. It helps us understand why birth weight is lower for children born to agricultural workers, and why those children are more likely to have chronic health conditions that their non-agriculture children of the same age wouldn't have. We know that in the United States, in big agriculture, women who are working in the fields, 80% report sexual harassment, and 1 in 3 women say that they have been or know someone who has been sexually assaulted while working in the fields. So if I'm saying that cannabis labor might be moving toward what big ag looks like, then I'm starting to sing the chorus that I've heard here throughout today, which is to say, we don't want to go that route. It's not a good place to be. And sadly, I think it's likely that things would be worse for people working in cannabis than in big agriculture because it's underground. And there's a lack of reporting, a lot of victim blaming, lack of services. So what about the legal sector? Something I hear a lot when I do this research and when I go to conferences is, this is a room full of people who largely work in the legal sector, or what we care about is regulating the legal sector. We don't have those problems. And I beg to differ. I see the legal sector moving in the direction of the big meat industry in the United States. So if you know anything about the big meat industry, it's always relied on relation labor. The work is extremely challenging and extremely dangerous. Human Rights Watch reports that of all manufacturing in the United States, to work in slaughtering and processed meat is by far the most dangerous. This explains why, until 2006, the people who worked in meat slaughtering facilities were the most vulnerable of our population, the people in our communities that are easiest to exploit, people who had migration statuses where they weren't allowed to work, who were undocumented. And in 2006, there was a raid across the United States on meat facilities, and the industry decided we can no longer hire people who might not be legal to work in the United States. Who should we hire? We should hire resettled refugees, because they are the next easiest to exploit in our community, and we know that they're legal to work and we're not susceptible to raids anymore. So what big meat looks like in the United States today is 35% immigrants, 10% coming from East Africa, pervasive wage theft, pervasive sexual harassment. Human Rights Watch reports a high number of injuries on the job and a hostile working environment, especially for workers of color, especially for Muslim workers. So in a famous case in Colorado, hundreds of Muslim workers were fired when they were organizing to have prayer times that suited their cultural needs, and were asking for the facility to help arrange some of the production practices around their needs. They were fired, there's been union busting, and people have been missing after organizing meat factory workers. It's a really vulnerable population. So I'm describing kind of the old market, what it looked like, in 2 ways I see the new market going in terms of labor and labor abuse. We know that the lines between what cannabis labor used to look like and will look like in the future isn't so clear, and the difference between illegal and legal sectors is not so clear. So to illustrate, I hear stories every time I talk to trimmers about what's going on right now. So I talked to a woman in Oregon a couple months ago who described last year looking for work on a legal farm and believing that the farm was licensed and was going to sell in the legal market. She wanted to be paid in the legal market. That was her intention. She was locked in a basement without her cell phone and not allowed to emerge until her trimming was done. These are typical stories that I hear all the time. This is someone aiming to work in the legal sector in Oregon this past year. So some of our conceptions about what happens now that cannabis is legal don't really map onto the reality of workers' lives. So if we don't want to go the route of big meat, and if we don't want to go the route of big agriculture, and we don't want to go the route of underground exploitation, then something needs to change. There's some special challenges I see in cannabis compared to making sweaters or shoes or growing coffee. The industry is reticent to highlight its problems, right? It's been a long fight, and I know I've followed the careers of many people in this room, and you fought long and hard to have cannabis recognized as something that is dignified and deserves a seat at the table, and to throw it under the bus by showing ways in which it exploits people can be challenging. And I've seen a lot of shoving labor problems under the bus as to not reveal a blemish in the industry, and I urge to be thinking of that. Nonprofit organizations won't touch cannabis with a 10-foot pole when it comes to labor rights. I've talked to every fair trade, domestic fair trade, workers' rights organization. With the exception of a couple of unions, no one wants to work with cannabis. That means it's the industry that has to do something. Consumers are not earmarking cannabis as places for ethical shopping. They don't go into dispensaries and ask for organic and fair trade every single time, even if they would in other markets or when shopping for other products. And people misunderstand labor practices and need to be educated about what fair labor looks like. So people think that if something's grown in Washington or Oregon, it must be fair labor or fair trade because it's the US of A. That's not accurate. So ways forward to close, the obvious things about policy and enforcement, employer education, workers' rights education, collective action. Supporting growers who are already doing these things. I'm sure there are people in the room. I spent a lot of time with these growers in Oregon. People who are paying health insurance, who are providing incredible work environments. Find them and urge them to share their practices and support them. I think Kevin said, vote with your wallet. Yes, vote with your wallet. Support voluntary initiatives. There have been lots of organic-like labels that have come up for cannabis. You might be familiar with Clean Green or Kind Certified. Since the USDA won't do organic label for cannabis, there are lots of substitutes that have come in. Some of those include labor provisions, some of them don't, and the ones that do include labor provisions can do a better job. So if you see something labeled as ethical, ask what that means for the people who are actually working in that product. I guess that I would say the last thing is consumer education, and I am happy to share over networking some statistics from 2 years ago in Portland. I had a number of college students go to a random sample of half the dispensaries in Portland, which was not hard to find college students for this research project. And we were asking for socially responsible and environmentally friendly cannabis, and we documented what people were willing to sell us and the claims they were making about those products. We gave 75% of dispensaries a B, C, not an A for quality of information. People said all sorts of crazy things, so I'd be happy to talk more about that later.
Hey guys, no, my name's Ann Bossett. I've been involved in cannabis for many, many years, before pre-taxation to I was asked to come here today to speak about economics on the Black community. And what are the effects of legal cannabis on the Black community? It just doesn't exist. It's a myth. There is no positive effects of legal cannabis on the Black community. It's not an inclusionary system at all. If you look at barriers to entry, which are one of the hardest reasons in the state of Washington to get a license, the two major factors are one, having a felony, which is a result of the war on drugs, probably wiped out 80% of all males in the Black community to get a license. Second would be wealth, capital, to be able to hold on to the license and be able to gain it. If you understand economics in the U.S., then you understand that there are racial disparities. This is not up for debate. This is fact. This is the housing bubble preyed upon the Black Spanish communities, Mexican communities. They, through all types of different policies, from the GI Bill to the Homestead Act to housing discrimination, all play into legal cannabis that we're sitting here talking about today, and why there is no positive effects on the Black community. The war on drugs, or let me start with housing discrimination. Housing discrimination is the biggest determination of wealth and capital gains in America. Like without home ownership, you have no access to wealth. You will, stay in a perpetual state of poverty. That then too is also tied to the education system. The education system is funded about the values of your homes. And if you value your home in a red line neighborhood was never able to gain equity or gain value in your home, there was never a chance for your schools to gain full funding and become an educated community. From those, if you have an uneducated community, if you have a wealthy private neighborhood, you come up with crime. Boom, the war on drugs is thrown on the Black community, on top of housing discrimination, on top of all these other redlining and everything else. That war, we all know now, was targeted at hippies and Black men. That's not up for debate. This is fact. We have the largest population of people in prison in the world, half of that population being Black men. That right there excludes millions of guys from being involved in the cannabis industry. A Black two-parent home making $100,000 still has less of a chance of buying a home today in America, today in 2017, than a one-parent home of a white neighborhood with a diploma. The wealth gap between whites and Blacks is like 12 to 1. The numbers are just, they're mind-blowing. All that leads into impoverished neighborhoods, poverty, which leads into the war on drugs, which leads to the targeting of Black men, which now we have legal cannabis, which it's hard to, for me, it's a racial, legal cannabis is really just a slap in the face of Black America. It's not, it hasn't, it's a failed social experiment. It's been exclusionary from day one. It hasn't addressed any of the issues. I mean, we just saw a young man up here speak about what it was like to go through war and PTSD, but the war on drugs is on Black men, but we can't get recognized for PTSD. Nobody will ever say anybody in my community has PTSD. Hence the non-inclusion or the non-wanting to be involved in a system that for so long victimized and criminalized the exact same thing that everybody in this room is attempting to do and build personal economic wealth. Not looking at the economics of the entire community, country. It's about personal wealth gain in the cannabis industry. It's not about growing economic growth. Every idea that has come forward has been based on an individual idea, not on the greater good of the community. If you look at what the trauma that Black Americans have suffered because of the war on drugs, it would also look, if you look around the room, explain to you why I'm one of very few Black men sitting in here. I think we can count on our numbers. This room isn't even demographically representative of the state of Washington, which is 8% Black males, or 8% Black people. We have less than 1% Black people in this room. So what are we doing in conclusion? What are we doing to address some of these issues? It's not being addressed, not by anybody, not by anywhere. I was just actually given a link today to the Oakland Equity Program, which might be the most progressive equity program in the country, but you can't get a license unless you help somebody that was disenfranchised through the war on drugs get a license. So there's ways to attempt it. I've been involved with cannabis in the state since 2009 when medical kicked off, and it's the same conversation. But what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Washington is looking at Black people to end the racist discrimination policy, but racism is not a Black problem. The problems of inclusion in the system is it's going to take everybody in this room to rethink what and how they're doing it. It can't be, inclusion cannot be you can be the security guard at the front door. Inclusion has to be executives. It has to be in administrative roles versus service roles. It has to be that the same person who's sitting in prison for bagging up weed and selling weed now has hireable skills towards a legal business but can't get in because he has a felony, which is mind-blowing, right? So my goal and my conclusion, is just really think twice and real hard about what it is you're doing in the legal cannabis space. Are you actively doing something? Or are you using guys like me for tokenism versus, participation? Slaves participated in the building of the great love of this America that were never rewarded. So I didn't ever come into legal cannabis with the expectation that it would be different. But I did expect some kind of inclusion somewhere along the line for what the war on drugs did to an entire community, and then the moving forward of it and the non-addressing of that issue. And it might not be an issue and a reality to a lot of people's world, but the other part, there's a part of America where the drug war is still happening to this day. We've talked about, and I've heard conversations in here today about the opioid epidemic and this and that, but they're still in South Seattle arresting young black kids for crack. How do we determine now that opioids are less more addictive or less harmful to society than crack? So the disparities in the drug war are still happening. We just don't talk about it. We just ignore them. And ignorance is bliss. Ignorance is safe. That's the safest place to hide, is in trouble with ignorance. So really think twice and hard about what you're doing moving forward. Again, your inclusion of minorities involved in this community, in this cannabis community. Because this thing isn't going to grow unless you start including everybody. It's just not going to grow without diversity. Our plants need diversity. We need diversity as humans too.
Ray, could you reset that timer, please? It's stuck on 5:02.
No, it's not.
Sorry, I was kind of counting on that to suddenly pop up whenever. Right. Thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Dr. Bennett, for coming today. In many ways, first I'll introduce myself. I kind of automatically assume everyone, a lot of people here already are familiar with me. I am Dr. Dominic Corba. I'm the founder and executive director of the Center for the Study of Cannabis and Social Policy. And I've worked with the Alliance and the predecessor to the Alliance these last 4 years, to develop the popular education aspect of cannabis legalization in ways that go beyond, industry formation and figuring out the problems with that. I mean, you guys kind of have a handle on that in many ways, but there's also the broader social issues, basically. I mean, I came to this and I started this organization slightly optimistically, I think, thinking that because the soul of the cannabis industry comes from oppressed people, to be honest, people in pain, oppressed people. When you say hippies, what we're really talking about is anti-war activists. Social movements in the 1960s. Amanda gave you a nice prelude to this general concept. The idea is that those values could at least be carried into a system that had a lot of problems, an economic system that already has a lot of problems. You heard Dr. Bennett talk about, cannabis agriculture. We don't want it to become like regular agriculture, actually. And I don't think we want any aspect of the cannabis industry to become like the way industry is in the United States, which in particular sets up, barriers to not prosperity but survival for an increasingly large amount of people. The increase in inequality in this country in the last 30 years is absolutely astonishing. We have seen public policy shift from at least pretending to care about the public and more towards let's enable the private sector to take care of our social policy and it turned to a free market and let that sort of, and what's happened is the concentration of local power in the hands of the few. And that has absolutely infected the way we do cannabis legalization in a very, very, very significant degree. So my broader purpose was to talk about racial political economy, but in a way that doesn't try to represent black people and black people's interests. And that's great. We need to do that. And you've got Aaron, thankfully, especially here speaking from that community. What I want to do is talk about kind of the big picture. And this past year has been very interesting for me as I've been asked to go speak, I think, in context where the things that I struggle with here in Washington State, get put into a different perspective. This past June, I was invited to go speak at a Theorizing the Drug War conference at the University of Essex in the UK. And it was fascinating because of all the perspectives there and the folks who are dealing with, really significant issues related to, the treatment of migrants, mules, violence against women. And I go in there and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm here from a place where we've got progressive drug policy and I'm going to complain about it. And so it really forced me to kind of like think a lot harder about what are those connections between what I see as the winnable battles here that I want to be fighting and the broader picture, which is global social change. That I think the way things are not good in every sense of the three words: international, political, economy, of which the U.S. is a major driver. So I want to remind us the purpose of legalization was to end the drug war. That was the point. That was the primary point. And I want to say that that's how I-502 certainly was sold. It was the primary way it was sold, was as a racial justice initiative with some cool things that, maybe there could be some markets that happen. Many of the initiatives that we've had so far are really, they're selling race, right? But what ends up happening is that it just gets forgotten. And I think by now there's plenty of evidence that this is a bait and switch in many ways to the public, who's otherwise, concerned about, racial injustice, economic injustice. And then we turn around and do our darndest to just completely forget about it and make it about state revenue, or make it about, who gets to be represented to the decision makers, which are people with a lot of money. So one of the other conference I'm going to be bringing into sort of the dialogue that I went to was the DPA conference in Atlanta, which was kind of like a breath of fresh air for me because I could go there and I could start at a higher level in the conversation. That I could go there and saying this and explaining this was not controversial at all, right? What's interesting about the DPA this year is that Ethan Nadelman has stepped down and there's new leadership at the DPA, which prior to now was focused on doing cannabis legalization initiatives because in and of themselves they would help end the drug war, right? And I think that the DPA is a dramatically shifted mission. It was one of the great things that I kind of saw at the Reform Conference, which is to put race front and center in this country when it comes to what the DPA is working on. And to some extent, the very few policy initiatives that do directly engage with race in particular, they intersect a little bit with some DPA people, right? Cat Packer down in LA. I mean, we're not talking about LA yet. They're taking an extra couple of weeks to get it figured out, but it's precisely because they're dealing with actually social equity. And so they're not just going to open it up and see what happens. They want to make sure they've got their process down. And Cat Packer is a big part of that. And I think one thing you can look forward to going forward is, in fact, that DPA functions as a funding mechanism for social change. No question. You're going to be seeing, I think, a lot more effort towards academic engagement and policy, fixes than you've seen before in different areas. So we can put it, well, where is the actually existing policy effort addressing racial political economy? Municipal regs, Oakland, San Francisco wants to copy Oakland, LA is doing it, but past that, there's not much here in Washington. And it was interesting in Nova Scotia, I was kind of asked, well, what are the racial justice things that you guys are doing? And I'm like, it's kind of left up to the private sector. I mean, as Aaron pointed out, the points in Oakland towards getting a license are, if you'll sponsor someone from an impacted community, right? Well, you're asking the private sector to do something that, to me, is it's good, it's better than nothing for sure, but it's basically like there's a public interest, and we're going to kind of leave it up to the private sector to do it. And I think that there's areas where that's appropriate, and areas where like, actually this is so big that actually we need to hit this head on. And barriers to access is really the fundamental issue, is that we've made it so tough to be a part of this industry, no small part, to meet regulatory issues, and until yesterday, apparently, to comply with the Cole memo, which, as it turns out, was much ado about nothing, literally now. So, you know, the Cole memo has been used as actually a way to reproduce racial injustice, because it's been used to keep barriers high. It's been used to, you know, prevent home grow from being a possibility. Here I want to give a shout out to Randy Simmons, because what he says, home grow is a small step, right? If you have home grow, you're not going to get research, real research, until it's like okay enough to even have home grow. I want to say that applies to the industry here too. Is that you want counties to stop banning, you want, you know, to be able to be allowed to sell and advertise and stuff. It's got to be okay with the general public to the degree that like home grow is okay. At that point, like you guys are going to be a lot more free to operate and do well and address your particular markets. It's that removing the stigma only helps you. And the folks who are opposing home grow for economic reasons, to me, I think you need to rethink that really, really carefully, because you are reproducing prohibition as a cultural institution. The other thing I want to talk about is that, you know, the word licenses to people, but we can't reconstruct communities. That actually the structural effects of prohibition, they're not just throwing, you know, one person in jail. The knock-on effects are the invisible punishments that happen after that, to the families. It breaks up the families. The incomes are gone. The communities themselves are just absolutely gutted. And I think that Richard Nixon's wet dreams, this pretty much, you know, really probably stimulated his endocannabinoid system. So the politics of racial political economy really, like, it's who can be represented? Who's the public? Whose public safety matters, right? And every time we talk about protecting the public, I want you to know that, like, generally speaking, when politicians talk about it, they're talking about the particular individuals or stakeholders who are paying lobbyists to tell them to say that. And I think that needs to change. Has to stop. Governance should not be a marketplace. Policy should not be something that are bought and sold. There should be public representation. You've got to work on representation and transparency when it comes to cannabis legalization. And that's, you know, that's not just going to help, you know, black communities and people of color. It's going to help, you know, the folks, the broader spectrum of population that is not represented, right? Like, you know, so the problem is bigger than cannabis. The problem is democracy and how to do it. And it's really important that you know, the racial argument is lifted up and amplified as part of the broader social problems, right? They're not just affecting black people, the oppression of black people affects you too, right? We want a better society. So, you know, as a result, like, questions that are total heresy to bring up in public can get discussed in arenas where, like, this understanding is there, like in Atlanta. So where you have actually, what about Pookie? What about the street corner drug dealer, right? Who loses his income? How do people participate? What about patients? What about HIV patients? What about people who actually were able to come together before at farmers markets and so forth and get therapeutic benefit out of it? It wasn't just a marketplace. It was also being together and not being stigmatized, which is kind of the story of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the social clubs in San Francisco. So, it's not just about making opportunities in a market. That can come, but removing politics of suspicion and fear, right? It's really important. Each small step we can take is important. I think in this state, like right now, like home grow is one of those small steps. Is that that's actually removing the stigma. If you can remove that, and like make people okay with that, remove the power of people with money to determine policy. So. That's my message, really, is that we need to let social policy govern markets, not the other way around. And that's going to lead to healthier markets. You guys are squeezed to death by complying with regulations that are there to protect the public, but that protection is political theater for the most part. And the thing is we can't go around, I think continue to stigmatize, folks who participate in the cannabis market, in the informal market either. I think it's anytime you advocate more punishment to prop up something, you're on the wrong side, and you need to look at what you're doing. So that's my message today, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Hi. I'm Toby Patterson. I'm a research economist at the Office of Financial Management at the state. So I'm one of 3 economists that support the governor's policy staff and other bits and pieces like the legislators. I worked for the USDA, National Agricultural Statistics Services, before I came back to Washington. I grew up here, so I was in the other Washington, sweating in a tie as a statistician, counting chickens. But no turkeys, really. So my job as a research economist with I found this pretty fun, but it leads me in all sorts of different ways. I also want to thank Laura for inviting me here. And I also want to note the people here are like really amazing. So,
You are too, Toby.
yeah, I'm tricky. So when I went to the LCB to provide economic guidance on how to institute a working market, I indicated that the market should define itself. And I said, the number of consumers was unknown. That the quantity demanded was some unknown number as well. And further, the number of producers and the volume produced was unknown. I recommended the notion that the number of producers and retailers would equilibrate as the market matures, and thus the number of licenses should not have a maximum. Just want to make that known. That's what I said. Several of the LCB constituents at the table vehemently disagreed. And I said, hey, I'm a capitalist. So the LCB hired an anti-cannabis drug policy person to guide their economic system. So in my mind, I was saying, look, a working market for cannabis and a reasonable expectation for the public is a market where consumers can buy a high-quality cannabis product that is uniform. The cannabis is pesticide-free. And the price is fair. So, in essence, an orderly, stable market that's safe, free of antitrust, and protects consumers. So what's the problem? Right. We have not recovered from the 1936 propaganda film Reefer Madness. It's just absolutely unfair. The trivial marketplace of farmers and buyers is instead a convoluted patchwork of entrepreneurs eager to create a capitalist market and crotchety men regulating based on archaic mythology and overreaching illogical reasoning. So, I'm a bit of a cynic. I'm not totally, I'm an economist. So I looked at this, and one of the things that always intrigues me about market failure is asymmetric information. You might remember, like, the cigarette industry used to say that cigarettes are actually good for you. They are. So I thought, okay, I'm going to look at this from purely like, what do we have here? What is provided to the public to know about this industry? So I just poked around and said, okay, well, the LCB is tasked with providing some sort of education material on marijuana, cannabis, reefer, whatever. And so I looked and I said, okay, well, I picked one subject fairly at random. I said, on their website it said, can getting high cause memory problems? And I said, okay, well, what is this? So I pressed on the link and it said, science-based information for the public. I said, okay, well that's interesting. It's produced or presented by the University of Washington. No offense. I went to both UW and WSU, so I have no affiliation. It was the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute, and it says scientists think that cannabis causes problems remembering, problems with grades, and negatively affects learning. I noticed, there's no citations whatsoever, and it says science-based right at the top. So I get a hold of them, I'm like, hey, you claim science-based, so where are the citations? And then, so they replied back, well, it was this one professor that used to be here, and he just, because he wanted a nice write-up that was easy for the public to read and digest, he just summarized it right there. And I said, okay, well, that it? And, well, the person pointed me to the National Science Foundation, or the National Academy of Science current release, maybe some of you have seen it. It's like 178 pages order, but I had already read it, and I was like, okay, well, that contradicts everything that your website says. So, what is the point? Is this education? What is it? What are you trying to do? Well, they never replied. But, so what is the purpose of the asymmetric information in this game? Who's winning? Why are the allegiances still there to this prohibition mindset? What is the purpose? And that's something that I wonder about, but I look at all sorts of markets. So the LCB adopted the same prohibition strategy as they used for alcohol. The same number of retail stores, exactly. That's how they got the 233 stores, right? Costco stole them. They're like, hey, well, we need something, right? I'm getting fired for saying all this. It's enforcement of enforcement. So the long history of prohibition has wide cultural implications. You may have heard marijuana is a very dangerous drug. Yet this hypothesis is profoundly unproven, and reality is not an impressive support of the assertion that cannabis is at all dangerous. Though the only thing I will say that cannabis is dangerous is enforcement, right? And how many people have you ever seen die from cannabis? None. But how many people have been arrested? Anyways, so what happens next? We can just see, but I will note that in Washington, the latest estimates are there are about 11,000 direct employment jobs in the cannabis industry. Though the wage rate is somewhere in the mid-$13 an hour range. So it's seemingly, I was kind of shocked it was that low. But, is the black market still there? So that's kind of, I leave you with that sort of ambiguous question. But beyond that, what's really the economic cost of prohibition? I mean, that's sort of in my mind's eye is like, why are we in this sort of lockstep of, it's not a free market at all. It's just this small microcosm of a few licenses which are given a maximum number for what reason I cannot figure out.
Ray, thank you for the wonderful introduction. Laura, thank you for the invitation to be here. And I'm honored to sit on a panelist of people who have such depth of knowledge about the state of the industry and its possible future. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. My name is Barb Tolbert, and I'm the mayor from the city of Arlington. We're a small community in North Snohomish County of about 18,000 people. We're what I like to call is on the urban edge. We used to be rural. We need to be sophisticated, and we are in quiet ways, and we butt right up against the big cities and the urbanness that happens in Snohomish County. So what I want to talk to you about today, with your indulgence, is I just want to tell you the story of Arlington and cannabis. and how it came about. And I hope through the story that you can gain some insight into how elected officials might be viewing the I-502 initiative, what it means to their community, and hopefully what you mean to their business initiatives. So first, I'm always excited to be in a room full of entrepreneurs. Thank you. It's a bold step, and I honor anybody who wants to step into business. In 2012, in November, State of Washington voted positively for I-502, Initiative 502, to allow cannabis operations in the state of Washington. I've been a mayor for 9 months. I've never sat in elected office before. We had huge problems in our city coming out of the recession. We were not recovered. We were really in the depths of it still, even though nationally the economy was starting to recover. And this was like, oh, okay, one more thing to add to the plate. I kept all of the literature that I had received from August through November, because there was a lot of, any kind of initiative, there's a lot of propaganda, pro and con. But I knew this was the message that our community was getting, and this is what we would have to talk about, how the vote went. So the first thing we did is we sat down and we looked at the numbers for our jurisdictions. Arlington, a conservative community in northern Snohomish County, had voted positively in the direction of I-502. So that's where we started. Our citizens wanted it. So we better figure out what we're going to do about it. I called a meeting of our senior managers that week together because I wanted to gauge where we were at as a city with this. You know, relatively new mayor, and many of them had been in their positions for a long period of time. And I wanted to hear honestly where they were at with this. And it was very interesting, and some of it, almost all of it, really mirrored the literature that had been going around the community for 2 months. Those in the public safety who had been being funded by the war on drugs for multiple decades were very nervous about the public safety concerns of the community. However, they couldn't really articulate those public safety concerns in drilling down on questions, but, you know, the kids, the school, oh my God, crime, all of those things that were going to happen to our community if we allowed this to happen. Our Community Economic Development Department, those of you who were here last year had the privilege of hearing Chris Young speak, building inspector's perspective on the industry. I found curiosity going on there. What does it mean, Mayor? What does it mean to your business initiatives? What's the employment look like? What's going to be the ratio of employees per square footage? How does this fit into our culture and our desire to be a manufacturing community? So there was some curiosity that was happening there. And then there was just a lot of ambivalence, like, oh, really, do you want to do this? And I was like, you know, it doesn't matter what we want to do. Our citizens have spoken to us. That's our job, to figure out how to make work what they want. So we went to work and we used our planning commission. How many of you are located in municipalities or counties? Got businesses in there? Yeah. You all have, within those who are planning under the Growth Management Act, aside from the elected officials, there's usually a panel of volunteers called the Planning Commission. And the Planning Commission sets about helping jurisdictions figure out a lot of the regulations under land use that are going to happen. So they deal with a lot of quasi-judicial things. They're the ones who are doing the comprehensive plans to figure out what zoning goes where and who can go where. So we knew that this would affect them too. Chairman of our Planning Commission said, hey, well, I'll take this on as research. Older gentleman, and we thought, you know, he's pretty fair and open, so we'll let him go do some research. And he began contacting people around the state of Washington who understood what the cannabis industry might mean. What does that look like, and what does it mean to a jurisdiction? And he brought us back a report that was devoid of any judgment, but really a lot of factual information. And a lot of it was, there's a lot of unknowns. This is the beginning of the legalization of an industry who we couldn't classify as an industry before because it was done on the black market and it wasn't legal. So we had to figure out what all of this would mean. Well, I saw the director starting to get a little intellectually curious at this. And Arlington, if you're intellectually curious, come talk to us about a job, because that's what we want. We'll train you what you need to know to do the qualifications, but we want people who are intellectually curious. So we began to get a little intellectually curious. How can we make this work? How does it fit into our initiatives? And there was a lot that went on in that period of time. But we also knew we had to educate the elected officials, myself and the city council members who would be responsible for this. So those of you who don't know, in the last 10 years, cities of all sizes have been driven by data. Through the recession and what happened afterwards, we're using data, big data, data dashboards, trying to make more effective decisions for the resources that we have. And we decided we'd apply some data techniques to understanding this industry. So we made charts of all of the information, all the propaganda, and all the fears of what was going to happen. And that became the metrics in the dashboard that we were going to measure as we started to regulate I-502 in our community. We also knew that the legislature and the liquor board at that time, now the Liquor Cannabis Board, had a really big job in front of them to figure out how they were going to regulate this industry and what it would look like. So we were smart enough to know that this was going to be an ever-changing play field. And I tell you this because it's important in your jurisdictions. Your elected officials who are watching this, whether they allow it or not, have seen dramatic changes in the regulation of this industry in the first 5 years. In the first 12 months, there was complete overhaul of some of the regulations that affect us at the local level for zoning and planning. That scares cities and municipalities off from this. Because it's like, how do I do something? Then I've got to pay attention and I've got to reform it and I've got to go somewhere with it. And we face those problems as well too. So I think it's important for you to know that. Stabilization of regulation, and when this industry gets to that point, is critical to its success and the ability for it to operate everywhere in the state of Washington. So we started with, we looked up the state, when they started applying for licenses, and we saw I think it was 49 businesses had applied for a license in the city of Arlington. So we kind of freaked out at that point. Like, oh God, we thought we could kind of beta test this. We got our dashboard, we know our metrics, we think we know where it's going to go, but we might be overwhelmed. And we set our first set of regulations under the guideline of the first Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 canopy size, of that structure that came into place. And so because we were trying to build a manufacturing community, and let me explain that initiative, which our cannabis industry clearly understands now. We want to provide a balance of housing and job growth in the community. And when I say job growth, I mean family wage jobs. Our goal is $18 an hour or more. And we want people to live and work in the community because that's what makes a healthier community. When families aren't spending 6 to 7 hours commuting and they're home and they can take the kids to baseball games or they can participate in school activities, the family structure is better. The neighborhoods then grow from that. The school system grows from that. And that's a real fundamental issue to healthy communities. So we wanted to look at what the job structure was. My story, I'm going to have to cut it short. I only have 4.5 minutes left. So I'm going to speed it up here a little bit. So after figuring out that we had to figure out with these 49 potential licenses out there, where we would start and how we would get enough time to pay attention to our data dashboard and know where we were going with it, we did put some limitations on the first year. We said we're only going to allow, I believe it was 12 or 14 producer processors to come in. We had places and identified where they will go, and we'll kind of study that. We'll go forward a couple of years after, I think 10 of them had been in operation for at least 12 months. We sat down with our data dashboard, and all of the propaganda literature, it wasn't true. It wasn't our experience. We had 0 public safety calls on cannabis operations. I mean 0, not a 1. Not even somebody, with an EMS call for a heart attack in the parking lot. Nothing. We had absolutely nothing. So we found that was pretty profound. The only issues that we did have, and they were really relatively small, was odor issues. It was smell. Our community wasn't used to that. We decided, okay, the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency is taking a whole nother tact on that. But maybe we could shore up some of our local regulations about carbon scrubbers and things where we knew that producer processors would be closer to neighborhoods and it would be sensitive. Because really, now as elected officials, all we want is we just don't want problems. We want to dispel the propaganda, and we want to try to find a way for this to work in the community. One of the most effective things that we did in Arlington was some of the research that we had done ended up being with people who were producer processors, some of the first ones in our community. So they had a relationship with our planning commission, which became a relationship with our senior management, and then became a relationship eventually with our elected people. Once we had a dozen producer processors in our community, we really wanted to tell them, this is so exciting, this is a brand new emerging industry. Rarely do we get to watch brand new emerging industry develop from birth to maturation. We don't get that opportunity very often. And we see shared economy like Uber and Lyft, but they're takeoffs on other industries. This is all brand new and it's really exciting. But there's an opportunity and a need for the industry to self-regulate in this. Because if you don't self-regulate, government officials who know nothing will regulate you. And that happens everywhere. So we asked our producer processors to form a coalition. It's called the ACC, the Arlington Cannabis Coalition. Chair of our coalition is here today, Sean. Thank you very much. We'll talk a little bit about your work. And Sean said, wow, that's a great idea. And I said, because we don't know what, we disproved some of the propaganda. The rest we're still measuring data on. But we need you to understand the city, and we need you to understand how to integrate into the city. We need you to understand what our priorities are. And you need to help us understand as a business how you fit those priorities. So they formed a coalition, they meet every month. Through this, we've brought in people to speak, local legislators, state legislators, local law enforcement, who has completely changed their mind on the cannabis industry. Probably not going to tell you or their kids that they're a fan of it, but they're no longer against it. They're no longer the arch enemy to legal cannabis, so they look at it. So those local relationships, if you are facing problems in your jurisdictions, if you get things that keep coming at you and you don't know where it's coming from, really all I want you here today is take a step to talk to the people who run your jurisdictions and listen to them, find out what their priorities are, and help them figure out a way to show that you're helping meet those priorities in their community.
All right. Normally, I don't ask questions, you do, but in this case, I'm gonna ask them. Aaron, I'm gonna ask a favor of you for me and for this audience. I facilitate a lot of things and people talk about stuff and then they leave. If they don't talk about concrete steps they can take to make something better, they have an interesting conversation with no impact. Can you give this audience a couple concrete steps that they can take in their life to have an impact?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I got notes for that.
I kind of figured you might.
Absolutely, absolutely. I believe one of the things.
Closer to the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. One of the things would be like having targeted entrepreneurial training and assistance programs, showing people how to do it. What are the steps that you have to go through, the hurdles that you have to go through. You've already done it. You've already experienced. You know what it is. Having entrepreneurial training classes, showing people, especially people who want to get in but are traumatized to get in, that look, this legal system is not coming to eat you. You're not going to go to jail. You're not going to be criminalized. Here's what the steps you have to do. Being intentional about having entrepreneurial training classes. Another thing is policy of examinations. Like really examine policy for like where you're located at. Really look at the policies and see what it is that's keeping certain people out, and figure out ways to maneuver those policies or influence those policies to try to help get more and more inclusion from people who, from a capital standpoint, cannot be involved. I believe that the normal model is probably the best model out right now, but as Dominic said, that's leaving the private sector to come up with a public issue. This was created probably through government law. So having us try to solve that, what are you fighting? You don't know what they might do the next day. Sessions can prove that. I'm not against what Sessions said, but a lot of people are. I think that what he did was great, because now it's going to make people address what this thing is for the first time. I think some other things are in being absolutely receptive, and don't take an angered stance or a definitive stance. Well, yeah, in the state of Washington, man, we deal with a lot of microaggressive racism in the state, and nobody wants to talk about it. This is one of the most racist states in America.
Thank you.
Don't be scared to hold the people around you accountable for their words and their actions. Check them on those things like, dude, that's racist, that's wrong. We have to be inclusive in this situation. Don't take a timid stance on it. Really stand strong and say, look, no, we can't continue this. Education programs, man, please, your local education programs, because of the Cleary Act and because of how the LCB set up where this tax stuff goes, our education systems are not being funded. So those impoverished neighborhoods are being hammered, and everybody has some kind of store, recreational, whatever it is, one of the 3 licenses in an impoverished neighborhood. Be intentional about your educational programs, where your stores, your grows, wherever your manufacturing is located. Be very intentional about getting involved with the educational programs.
Okay? Don't see a hand at the moment. Yeah. So let me ask one more question. This one's for you, Mark. If I remember correctly, you told me a quick story about how one of the stores in town was then invited into the business association of the town.
Yeah. We're a blessed community up in Arlington, because I think sometimes we really are open-minded. But one of the things when we're looking at this new industry coming in is, you know, in every other business in the towns and the counties where you operate have some sort of association, a chamber of commerce, a business association. These are really valuable and fundamental pieces in the business culture because they allow access to expertise and problem solving and sharing of ideas that I didn't see happening with the Cannabis Coalition in the beginning. It was a very closed model. It was a very uncertain model. It didn't know what it was facing in the marketplace. As the economist said, we had no idea what the customer base would be, what supply and demand would look like. There were a lot of pressures. So in our community, we set out to invite a couple of the newer businesses into the larger service groups and to the chamber to give presentations. And I also say something that really impacted and changed other people's minds was the manufacturers were willing to do tours. So they were willing to, that visualization of from reefer madness to a manufacturing sophisticated industry was priceless in that. And now the Cannabis Coalition is viewed as one of the kind of industries in Arlington. They participate in Rotary. They work with me on fundraising for the appropriate causes. I mean, everybody out there thinks that you're making $1 million a month. I'm just going to tell you, I hear this every day. Oh my God, they're just raking in the dough. People don't understand your business model. They don't understand the regulations or the taxations on your businesses. You're not making $1 million a month. Your expenses to your income is incredibly mind-blowing. But there's a lot of stories not told. But integrating into a normal business culture in a community can go a long way to what I think I've heard every panel up here talk about today, which is educating people about the truth in the industry.
If this industry is making $1 million a month, Kim and I need to raise our rates from 0 to something.
First question.
Todd, you mentioned you had shared your report to the LCB at a meeting, but did you share your report on the store cap, or your thoughts or what you shared with us on the store cap? And a follow-up to that, if you don't mind, if you can provide your thoughts on how to expand access without diluting the market share of pre-existing retail licensees.
Well, I talked to the LCB a few different times, and in the first instance, that it was like at the beginning, and then another instance, it was at the 502 occurrence, and you know, I think that they had already made their mind up, so to speak, whether I said whatever I said. Which I'm more a free market. I'm for the free market per se, but I carefully use that term. I was pressing them to let the market expand as it should in an unfettered type of way, where comers to the market can come and leavers leave as they go out of business in a functioning market. To guide the retail system, I place the idea upon, like, with entering into a medical perspective, that if you look at, like, how many places can you buy aspirin? You know, not to say that the retail establishments should be diluted that much, but there's obviously a demand for medical products that, in my mind's eye, should be more accessible than to go to one of the few stores. And I recently did a look at how far anyone in the state had to drive to get to how many people were within 20 miles of a cannabis establishment. I haven't published that data yet, but I will put that out at some point. Working with the demographics team in OFM. But I think that the market, in my mind's eye, should be a lot bigger. I think it is a lot bigger than we're seeing, and there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on. So,
There you go.
was there another part of your question that I just totally avoided?
So I guess I wasn't specific enough, and if you don't mind me shouting it out, I apologize. We're at a cap of stores, and you specifically said that cap is, in other words, BS. And how do we adjust from here? We already have licensees going. We have the other issues, but if we need access, then how do we implement that? If you have an idea on that, please.
Well, I think, in my mind, it should be based, it should just be population based. And it seemed to me that it was quite simple that you look at, you just have to have some proxy of what the demand looks like. Do you do it like how many bars there are? The alcohol and marijuana in my mind's eye aren't even similar in any, really. But once you enter medical, then it's like, how many stores you have becomes a whole other thing. And so I think, we had a bunch of, at the time the 502 Botec study came out, there were 470 something medical establishments paying taxes to the Department of Revenue. How a study got out that said 333, I don't know. WTF. Really. I'm not trying to.
And how they were dispersed?
Right, and how they were dispersed is sort of, I don't, that's like,
Cannabis ice.
yeah, or something that had to call, I don't know. Well, that's the process. The retail licenses were,
Large.
and then the cannabis side, but that's, again, I would say that would be all comers to the market. If you want to try to grow it, grow it. You live in Washington, so it's going to be expensive, or to try it from Washington, I guess.
So a number of years ago, business associations were trying to figure out how much of a business type could exist in a population base. And what they came up with is a very rough, unscientific term. But basically, they would take the population base and say, okay, 6 to maybe 8% of that number is how many pizza shops you can support, or how many garages you can support. It's not scientific by any means, but that's what they were using to say, we have a membership in this area, we can support about this many people, essentially. Back to you.
Barb, thank you so much for sharing. I really admire you, and I love your intellectual curiosity statement, job-seeking statement. I have friends. And which led me to this question, which is true. So, City of Arlington has taken a very methodical approach to embrace this industry who has proven itself to you. How do you treat new employees? Do you drug test and exclude marijuana? Or are you still adhering to excluding anyone who pops for marijuana from employment within the city?
That's a great question. Thank you. We do still have a no tolerance policy for drugs in the city of Arlington. And it probably will be there for a while until the industry is more accepted and normalized into the state of Washington. So we still have that. Okay, next question.
Thank you. I just have a question for anyone who wants to answer. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions were done in South Africa, and then I saw Aaron went to South Africa under this bio. So that was a solution the government had to deal with long-standing structural violence. It was in the laws between blacks and whites in Africa, South Africa. And so I'm wondering if maybe states, governments, local places could do such things, get law enforcement people, affected community members to have listening sessions, some truth and reconciliation to kind of help us process some of the longstanding social trauma that we've lived under that doesn't get voiced as much. And employment drug testing has a lot to do with insurance, the Insurance Drug-Free Workplace Act and workplace insurance. And so those laws need to change so that you don't have to have a drug testing policy to get workplace insurance.
Exactly, thank you. I can say that, Mark.
Jump in here real quick, Aaron.
Go for it.
I know it's addressed to you, but Truth and Reconciliation Commissions require political, representation to happen. And it's not there, but there's a word I want to use in conversation with Aaron, which is expungement of criminal records, which the state of California actually has a process for that. Washington State actually had a bill to do it, but enthusiasm for that died in like 2015. Apparently, the lobbyists were not terribly, motivated to pursue that. City of Spokane apparently tried to pass one. One thing you could do, industry, is attach criminal record expungement to your next legislative priority list.
Yeah.
Is attach it, and then the industry, you can hold expungement clinics. You can go into your retail parking lot and say, today we're expunging criminal records right here. And that will have a bigger effect than just your employment in the marijuana industry because your criminal record prevents you from being employed in other places.
And I was just going to say that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it sounds good on paper, but all that was a way for white men to get out of the way, get excused for killing black men. They had to sit there at the table and admit to black families, yes, I killed this person. This is why I did it. This is where I dumped the body, and then they were never held accountable. So no, we don't want Truth and Reconciliation.
Okay, this looks like our last question.
Okay, touching primarily to Toby, and with respect to the notion of access to the product, I've been forecasting and estimating the size of this market since it started. And a dynamic emerged about midway through last year that was independent of the SSB 5052 implementation. And it struck me that it appeared as if a significant number of consumers that had been using the regulated system were beginning to go elsewhere. I don't know if they're stopping using or whatever, but when you look at the transactional data across time and standardize it against the population characteristics of the local areas, it's very clear that something happened about midway through, not last year, the year before, that just started kicking in bad time. Right now, I think this market is underperforming by about 20% just on a revenue basis, a transactional basis, largely driven by the lack of retail access. Even though there's 556 licenses allocated, there were fewer than 400 stores that sold more than $1,000 in product last calendar year. And it just blows my mind. And fewer than half of those have a medical certification from the Department of Health. So, from the government's perspective, from the governor's perspective, if revenue is important in this state, particularly when it's a harm reduction strategy, if you're shifting a recreational and or other use to this product, why is it acceptable that an agency of the government can use crap science, which is demonstrably just ridiculous, false, wrong, to slap on something that basically is, this is how many liquor stores we used to regulate, so that's how many cannabis stores we're going to regulate. We're staffed for that. To decrease the revenue, and at the same time, while forcing medical patients and medical providers to either go into the regulated system or to decriminalize themselves, and then to basically shut off the spigot through regulation and I think punitive legislation in a few instances, so that fewer than 5% of the producers have produced medical product. Less than 1% of the product sold was medical last year. Less state sales tax. And fewer than maybe 1/5 of the access points we had at the Green Cross area are currently able to serve patients as patients. That is a broken system, in my opinion. We can make more money and we can serve the needs of the patient, public better. Do you think the governor might be interested in that?
That was a succinct version.
You're testing my gangling matter on this one, but I think Jay is interested in the marketplace, whether he's down at this fundamental level or the micro level at this juncture. I don't know, because as I've said before, actually not here, but the entire amount of revenue to the state is dust in the wind. This industry is very small. So do they care that? They care only as much as the money goes up, right? Aerospace, they really care. Tech, they care. But no, the reality is that when they started releasing the licenses, I jokingly did a little calculation and said, well, in 11 years, they'll actually get to the 233 licenses. Well, they still aren't there, but now we can get to 530, whatever. Yeah, it's a really weird, I don't understand what they're doing with that, but I will say that it was when Portland, Oregon, made it legal to grow at home. I got on the phone with some producers. I don't know if anybody, I don't know really, I just called it random, sort of the guys that were in Vancouver. And I said, hey, what's going on? And a couple of them were like, well, I just lost 50% of my business that week. And so recently I was down in Portland, and one of the guys I was with came back and he goes, man, I just got an 8th for $17. And it's some of the best I've ever had. And I said, okay, cool. And he goes, that would have been $56 in Seattle, where he's from. So, luckily, nobody's bringing it back and forth. But truly, I think, in my own personal opinion, takeaway, whatever my affiliation, I think what happened to the medical industry is totally unethical and immoral.